Duchess Ludovika in Bavaria. Most people know her only as Magda Schneider, the lovable mother from the old Sisi films. But the real Ludovika was different, down to earth, mother of a large family, and yet deeply unhappy. Who was she really? And what happened to Sisi's brothers and sisters? To understand this story, we need to go back to the beginning. Before the embroidered dresses, before the balls, before the crown. We need to go back to a girl who grew up learning to smile, while her destiny was decided by others. She was born in 1808, the daughter of a king. She grew up surrounded by protocol, halls lit by chandeliers, and corridors where every step echoed duty. From the age of 4, she already knew how to behave before the court. She already knew how to tilt her head at the exact angle. She already knew that a princess does not belong to herself. Literature, geography, history, French, the obligatory language of diplomacy. She learned everything, but there was something no one taught her: how to be happy. Ludovika grew up in the shadow of brighter figures. Her sister was ambitious, a strategist destined to influence empires. Her half-brother would inherit the Bavarian throne. And she was the other daughter, not the most beautiful, not the most charismatic, not the most important. In the silent hierarchy of European courts, this meant only one thing. She would be a bargaining chip. In 1824, during a trip to Vienna for a family wedding, something unexpected happened. She met an exiled prince, a man marked by political conflicts, surrounded by controversy, a man who had rebelled against his own father. Dangerous, but there was something rare between them in those cold circles: true affection. They talked for hours. They laughed. They walked. He saw her, not as a diplomatic tool, but as a woman. Years later, already elderly, Ludovika would confide to her granddaughter, "I was his first true love." He asked for her hand in marriage. Her father immediately refused. Marrying his daughter to a man involved in political turmoil? Unthinkable. Too risky. The love was interrupted, but not forgotten. For years passed. The prince returned, now no longer exiled, but king. He asked for Ludovika's hand in marriage again, this time decisively. But the answer never arrived in time. The letter with the request crossed mountains and lakes and arrived 5 days too late. 5 days. Ludovika had already married another man. She never knew he had returned for her. Or did she? Some historians believe the family may have hidden the information. Perhaps she never had the chance to choose. The love of her youth had become a permanent shadow, and shadows in that family never completely disappeared. The man she married wasn't cruel at first glance. He was handsome, charismatic, an artist. He played the zither. He wrote music. He loved freedom, but he didn't want to get married. Just like her, the marriage was arranged for political convenience. The original bride, Ludovika's younger sister, had died, and Ludovika was chosen as a replacement. Replacement, not out of love, not out of affinity, but out of necessity. On September 9th, 1828, on the shores of Serene Lake, the two said, "I do." Witnesses spoke of a beautiful couple, but no one saw what was happening inside. Shortly after the ceremony, he confessed he had only accepted the marriage out of fear of his grandfather. On their first wedding anniversary, Ludovika spent the entire day crying. From dawn till dusk. No scandal, no shouting, just silent tears. He had extramarital affairs, abrupt mood swings, moments of aggression. In one argument, he even grabbed one of his daughters violently enough to shock the family. Ludovika reacted with silence. She shut down. She stopped talking. She disappeared emotionally. She was criticized for it, but no one asked how she felt. In 1832, she gave birth to a boy. A few weeks later, he died of whooping cough. The pain was devastating. It wasn't just the death of a child. It was confirmation that not even motherhood, the only role left to her, was under her control. She fell into a deep depression. She became apathetic, distant, empty gaze. In a time when mental health was not understood, female suffering was interpreted as weakness. But Ludovika was not weak. She was broken, and yet she continued. There was something peculiar about her. From a young age, she enjoyed drawing plants. She studied botany. She admired greenhouses and gardens. Later, she developed a curious obsession, measuring instruments. Clocks, thermometers, barometers, any object that measured time or weather fascinated her. It was as if she wanted to control what always eluded her. Love, death, destiny. When the first telephone systems appeared, she insisted on installing one in her palace. Always attentive to the new, always try to maintain some kind of control. But life could not be measured precisely, and the destiny of that family seemed to follow its own logic, almost cruel. In 1834, her husband bought properties on the shores of a stunning lake. For him, it was just another acquisition. For her, it became survival. There, far from the suffocating rigidity of the court, Ludovika breathed. She walked for hours, without jewelry, without protocol, knocking on neighbors' windows on her way home, talking to peasants, opening all the castle windows to let the air in. She wanted light. She needed air. It was in that setting that her children would grow up, with more freedom than expected for young nobles. Among them, a girl with dreamy eyes and an indomitable spirit. Elisabeth, Sisi, the daughter who would change the history of Europe, and perhaps repeat her mother's story. In the summer of 1853, Ludovika traveled with 2 daughters to celebrate the birthday of a young emperor. The plan was simple, but fate once again decided otherwise. And in a matter of days, the unprepared teenager became the fiancé of one of the most powerful men on the continent. That night, while everyone celebrated, Ludovika didn't sleep. She wrote a letter, and in it there was no pride. There was fear. The summer of 1853 should have been simple. A birthday celebration in Bad Ischl, fresh mountain air, informal gatherings, a family reunion among Europe's intertwined dynasties. Ludovika traveled with 2 of her daughters, Helene, the eldest, dutiful and prepared, and Elisabeth, only 15, still half-child, half-wild creature of the Bavarian lakes. The expectation was clear, though never spoken aloud. The young Emperor of Austria, Franz Joseph, was of marriageable age. A suitable bride from within the family would strengthen alliances and keep power contained within trusted bloodlines. Helene was considered the appropriate choice. She was older, more disciplined, more aware of court protocol. She had been quietly prepared. Elisabeth was brought almost as a companion. History would turn on that assumption. When Franz Joseph first saw them, he did not choose the elder sister. He chose Sisi. Witnesses later described the moment as sudden and unmistakable. He was captivated. The shy girl with loose hair and hesitant posture became the center of imperial attention within hours. 2 days later, he asked for her hand. It happened that quickly. Overnight, a teenager who had spent her days riding horses along Lake Starnberg was engaged to one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Celebration erupted around them. But Ludovika did not celebrate. On the day of the engagement, she wrote to a confidant. Her words were not triumphant. They were anxious. She called it a great blessing, but also an immense and difficult position. She emphasized how young her daughter was, how inexperienced. She understood something others did not. She knew what it meant to enter a marriage shaped by politics rather than tenderness. She had lived it, and she saw in Elisabeth the same sensitivity that had once made her vulnerable. Sisi was ascending a throne straight from childhood, and childhood was about to end. The imperial court in Vienna was nothing like Possenhofen. It was rigid, controlled, watched. At its center stood Archduchess Sophie, Franz Joseph's formidable mother and Ludovika's own sister. If Ludovika had once lived in Sophie's shadow, now her daughter would live under her authority. The irony was merciless. Elisabeth's marriage in 1854 was a spectacle of splendor. Crowds cheered, bells rang. The young empress dazzled the public. But behind the facade, cracks appeared quickly. Sophie controlled the household. She controlled the education of Sisi's children. She dictated protocol. Elisabeth, isolated in Vienna's Hofburg Palace, began to wither. Ludovika watched from Bavaria with growing alarm. Letters traveled between mother and daughter, carrying homesickness and despair. Elisabeth longed for the freedom of the lake, for the long walks in forests, for the uncomplicated affection of her siblings. In Vienna, every gesture was observed, every word measured, every weakness criticized. The pattern was repeating. A young woman entering a gilded cage. The difference was that this cage held an empire. While Elisabeth struggled in Austria, the other children of Ludovika's large family were carving paths that would bring both distinction and scandal. Her eldest surviving son, Ludwig Wilhelm, had been raised with strict discipline. Military training shaped him early. Ludovika never fully trusted the harshness of that upbringing. In 1859, Ludwig made a decision that shocked the family. He renounced his birthright to marry an actress. An actress. In the rigid hierarchy of European nobility, this was rebellion. He chose Henriette Mendel, a woman of talent, but not royal blood. For love, he stepped away from dynastic expectation. It was an echo of something Ludovika understood too well. Love denied in her youth, now pursued defiantly by her son. Henriette was granted a lesser title, but the marriage was never fully accepted by all relatives. They had a daughter, Marie-Louise. That child would later become Countess Larisch, a woman whose name would be forever linked to one of the darkest episodes in Habsburg history, the tragedy of Mayerling. The shadow was already forming, though none of them knew it yet. After Henriette's death, Ludwig remarried another actress, Emmy Barth. That marriage failed. Stability eluded him. Helene, known within the family as Nene, carried her own burden. She had once stood on the brink of becoming empress. Instead, she became the sister who was not chosen. Relatives could be cruel. Comments about her appearance circulated. She was described as difficult, serious, overly devout. As the years passed and no husband appeared, whispers began. By her early 20s, she was considered nearly too old for a brilliant match. Ludovika intervened. Through careful negotiation, Helene met hereditary Prince Maximilian of Thurn and Taxis. He was impressed by her sincerity. Despite concerns over rank and compatibility, the marriage took place in 1858 at Possenhofen. It proved to be one of the few truly harmonious unions among Ludovika's children. For once, a daughter seemed secure. Yet even this happiness was not permanent. Maximilian would die young, leaving Helene widowed with children. Joy in that family rarely endured untouched. Karl Theodor, often called Gackle in childhood, followed an unusual path. He began as a soldier, fighting in the Austro-Prussian and later the Franco-Prussian conflicts. War hardened him, but something shifted. He left the military and turned to study. Humanities first, then medicine. In 1880, he received his doctorate and became an ophthalmologist. He founded an eye clinic in Munich and performed thousands of cataract operations. For a member of the House of Wittelsbach to dedicate himself to healing rather than ruling was remarkable. Ludovika admired his seriousness. In him, she saw purpose. Marie, another daughter, married into the kingdom of the two Sicilies at only 17. Her wedding ceremony initially took place without the groom present. Such was the nature of dynastic arrangements. She became queen of a realm already trembling politically. Revolution loomed. Nationalist movements threatened the old order. Her reign would be brief and unstable. Eventually, she returned to Bavaria carrying emotional and political scars. Mathilde, delicate and sensitive, married into Italian nobility and spent much of her life abroad. Rumors of an affair circulated. Court society devoured such whispers eagerly. Ludovika refused to condemn her daughter publicly. Loyalty to her children remained unwavering. Then there was Sophie Charlotte. Her story would intertwine with one of Bavaria's most enigmatic figures, King Ludwig II. They had grown up near one another, bound by shared romanticism, by music, by admiration for Richard Wagner's operatic worlds. Their affection deepened over time. Under pressure from family, clarity was demanded. Was the king serious? Ludwig, too, was a man divided between duty and inner conflict. He struggled with his identity, with expectations, with desires he could not openly acknowledge. An engagement was announced in 1867. Celebrations began. Then postponements followed. Excuses accumulated. Whispers grew louder. In the end, the engagement collapsed. Sophie, supported by her father, broke it off. Another union dissolved. Another daughter marked by disappointment. Years later, Ludwig too would be found dead under mysterious circumstances in Lake Starnberg, not far from the landscapes that had once shaped Ludovica's children. Water seemed to follow this family like a silent witness. Max Emanuel, the youngest son, embraced military life and also composed music. His marriage brought no great scandal, but neither did it escape strain. Across decades, Ludovica remained the gravitational center. Despite her own unfulfilled marriage, she anchored her children. When Karl Theodor lost his wife, she took in his daughter Amalie, forming a quiet bond of trust. Grandchildren filled the halls of Passenhofen. She aged but did not retreat. Time passed, and tragedy intensified beyond anything she could have imagined in youth. In 1888, her husband suffered strokes and died. Whatever distance had defined their marriage, his death marked the end of a shared history spanning 60 years. A year later came devastation. In January 1889, Crown Prince Rudolf, her grandson through Elisabeth, was found dead at Mayerling alongside Baroness Mary Vetsera. The official narrative spoke of suicide, but Europe whispered murder, political conspiracy, silent scandal. The truth remained murky. For Ludovica, speculation mattered less than loss. She had buried a grandson destined for empire. The curse, some murmured, persisted. By then, she had already outlived siblings, nieces, nephews, even some of her own children. Longevity became its own burden. She watched as Elisabeth withdrew further from court life, traveling obsessively, avoiding Vienna, seeking escape in motion. In 1898, 6 years after Ludovica's death, Elisabeth herself would be assassinated in Geneva by an anarchist blade. Ludovica did not live to see that final tragedy. Perhaps that was mercy. In her final years, she remained devoted to routine. Walks, nature, letters, measured observation of weather and time. Servants described her as truthful, grounded, devout without ostentation. She spoke kindly to peasants and nobles alike. She valued decorum but despised unnecessary rigidity. On January 26, 1892, at the Herzog Max Palace in Munich, she died at 83. A lady-in-waiting wrote that her passing was not merely the loss of an elderly woman, but the loss of the bond that had held the family together for decades. When she closed her eyes, an era quietly ended. Yet questions linger. Did she ever stop thinking about the letter that arrived too late? Did she ever wonder whether her life might have unfolded differently had she been allowed to marry for love? Did she see, in the destinies of her children, reflections of her own sacrifices? History often remembers her only as the mother of an empress. But beneath that title was a woman shaped by denied passion, political obedience, maternal devotion, and relentless resilience. Her story is not one of crowns. It is one of endurance. And in that endurance lies the tension that defined an entire dynasty. This is only part of the full chronicle. I will continue expanding the narrative in the next block, deepening the psychological layers, political context, and interwoven tragedies until we reach the full length requested. In the years before her death, those who observed Ludovica closely noticed something subtle but unmistakable. She had stopped expecting happiness. There was no dramatic declaration, no confession, just a quiet recalibration of the soul. She lived instead in maintenance mode, maintaining family ties, maintaining traditions, maintaining composure. It was a skill she had perfected over decades. Passenhofen remained her sanctuary. Even as age bent her posture and slowed her stride, she insisted on walking outdoors whenever possible. The lake shimmered as it always had. The mountains stood indifferent to human grief. Seasons turned with mechanical reliability. Nature never betrayed her. People did. Her relationship with her husband had softened in old age, not into romance, but into familiarity. The sharp edges dulled. They had survived one another. That, in aristocratic marriages of the 19th century, counted as something. Maximilian, with all his eccentricities, his affairs, his artistic temperament, had never truly understood her need for emotional steadiness. But time had reduced conflict to routine coexistence. When he died in 1888 after 2 strokes, Ludovika did not collapse in public. She organized. She received condolences. She fulfilled expectations. Privately, she confronted something more complicated than grief. She confronted the end of a life that had never been what she wanted, yet had defined her entirely. 60 years of marriage cannot simply be dismissed as misfortune. They leave marks. After his death, she became even more central to the family network. Children and grandchildren visited her not only out of affection, but for grounding. She represented continuity. Yet continuity could not protect them from the accelerating instability of Europe. Empires were shifting. Nationalism was rising. Industrialization was transforming societies that once revolved around hereditary rule. The world into which Ludovika had been born, rigid and hierarchical, was slowly eroding, and her family stood directly in the fault lines. Elisabeth, now Empress of Austria for decades, had become a mythic figure, celebrated for beauty, criticized for detachment, admired for independence. She drifted across Europe in restless motion. Mother and daughter shared letters that alternated between affection and distance. There were things Elisabeth could never fully articulate to her mother. The suffocation of Vienna, the trauma of losing her first child, the relentless scrutiny of court life. But Ludovika understood more than she revealed. She recognized the signs of a spirit trapped inside expectation, because she had lived them first. The death of Crown Prince Rudolf in 1889 was the moment that shook the entire dynasty to its core. Rudolf was not only heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, he was the fragile hope of reform within a rigid imperial system. When news reached Bavaria that he had been found dead at Merling alongside a young baroness, disbelief rippled outward. Official statements framed it as a tragic pact of suicide. Rumors insisted otherwise. Political conspiracy, assassination disguised as scandal, silencing of inconvenient ideology. The truth remained entangled in secrecy. For Ludovika, speculation was secondary to devastation. Rudolf was her grandson, the son of the daughter she had once feared would be crushed by imperial pressure. Now that daughter faced a grief so profound it altered her permanently. After Mayerling, Elisabeth withdrew further from public life. She dressed increasingly in black. She traveled obsessively. She avoided Vienna for long stretches. Movement became her anesthesia. Ludovika watched from afar, aging, aware that she could no longer shield anyone from fate. The sense of a pattern became difficult to ignore. Denied love, strained marriages, broken engagements, political upheaval, mysterious deaths. Observers of the Wittelsbach and Habsburg lines sometimes whispered of a curse, not in supernatural terms, but in psychological ones. A lineage marked by emotional isolation, artistic intensity, rebellion against duty, and catastrophic consequences. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, once engaged to Sophie Charlotte, had long fascinated Europe. He built fantastical castles. He immersed himself in Wagnerian myth. He avoided marriage. He withdrew from governance. In 1886, declared mentally unfit to rule, he was deposed. Days later, he was found dead in Lake Starnberg alongside his psychiatrist. Officially drowning, unofficially mystery, the same lake whose shores had given Ludovika solace. Water again. It is tempting to romanticize such symmetry, but for Ludovika, it meant watching yet another young life extinguished amid unanswered questions. Sophie Charlotte, once nearly queen, carried her own scars. She later married the Duke of Alassa and died tragically in the Bazaar de la Charite fire in Paris in 1897 after Ludovica's death. That final horror she did not witness, but enough sorrow had already accumulated. In conversations during her last years, Ludovica rarely indulged in self-pity. Those who expected dramatic lamentation found instead practical reflection. She spoke of weather, of harvests, of small improvements in household management. And yet, beneath that practicality, there was depth. A granddaughter once described her as truth-loving, grounded, possessing a dry Bavarian humor, devout without theatrical piety, strict but not unkind. She avoided unnecessary constraint but insisted on dignity. She was capable of warmth with peasant women and composure before royalty. Duality defined her. Perhaps that was her quiet rebellion. She did not shatter the system that constrained her. She endured within it while carving small spaces of authenticity, opening windows wide at Passenhofen, walking without jewels, installing telephones because she was curious about modernity, surrounding herself with clocks and barometers as if measuring stability, control where she could find it. When she died in January 1892, Europe was already on a trajectory toward upheaval that would culminate decades later in World War and the collapse of empires. She belonged to an earlier chapter, and yet her descendants would stand at the center of that coming storm. Elisabeth's assassination in 1898 would transform her into legend. The Austro-Hungarian Empire would fall in 1918. The world Ludovica had navigated with cautious discipline would disappear. Looking back, her life reads not as a fairy tale prelude to Sisi's glittering image, but as a study in restrained tragedy. She loved once and was refused. She married without passion. She buried children. She watched daughters step into unions shaped more by politics than compatibility. She saw sons rebel against dynastic expectations. She outlived almost everyone of her generation. And through it all, she remained. There is tension in that constancy. In popular memory, she is softened, simplified, turned into the gentle, cinematic mother figure portrayed by Magda Schneider in mid-20th century films. But the real Ludovica was not a decorative presence in someone else's romance. She was the structural beam holding a complex family architecture together. Remove her and fractures widened. The question that lingers is not whether she was happy. Evidence suggests she rarely was in the romantic sense. The question is whether she found meaning. Meaning in motherhood, meaning in continuity, meaning in quiet influence. Her letters reveal intelligence and clarity. She was not naive about the dangers surrounding her children. When Elisabeth's engagement was announced, Ludovica's instinct was concern, not triumph. She had seen the machinery of power from within. She knew its cost. Perhaps that is the most haunting element of her story. She could foresee suffering, but she could not prevent it. In that, she was profoundly human. History often elevates the dramatic figures, the assassinated empress, the mad king, the tragic crown prince. But behind each of them stood a woman who once walked along a Bavarian lake trying to breathe freely. A woman who opened windows wide against suffocation. A woman who measured time as if it might obey her. The tension of her life lies not in a single catastrophic event, but in accumulation. Small disappointments layering over larger ones. Private tears behind public composure. Unanswered letters. Delayed messages. 5 days that changed everything. If the letter from her first love had arrived earlier, would Europe's dynastic map have shifted? Would Elisabeth have been born into a different context? Would mailing have occurred? Counterfactual history is seductive but unanswerable. What remains is record. And the record shows a woman shaped by obedience who quietly cultivated resilience. In the end, Ludovica's greatest act may not have been marrying, nor giving birth to an empress, nor navigating scandal. It may have been surviving without surrendering her essential character. Grounded, observant, emotionally wounded, yet functional. the heart of a family whose name still evokes grandeur and grief. And perhaps, in the silent spaces between documented events, there linger questions we cannot resolve. Did she ever dream of Portugal? Did she imagine an alternate life far from Bavarian winters and Viennese politics? Did she forgive her parents for the decision that redirected her destiny? No diary records such confessions explicitly, but human nature suggests memory does not vanish simply because duty intervenes. When she stood at her window in Munich during her final winter, watching snow settle over rooftops, she had lived through revolution, scandal, birth, betrayal, and death. She had witnessed the transformation of Europe from Napoleonic aftermath to industrial acceleration. She had seen carriages give way to early telecommunication. She had adapted without losing her provincial steadiness. Her death was quiet. No assassination, no conspiracy, no drowning in moonlit water. Just age. Perhaps that was her final defiance against a lineage addicted to drama. She exited without spectacle. Yet the echoes of her life continue, threaded through the myths of Sisi, the mysteries of Ludwig II, the tragedy of Rudolf. To understand them fully, one must begin with her, not as a background figure, but as a woman who knew too early that fairy tales rarely survive contact with power, and who endured anyway. I will continue further, expanding the psychological and political dimensions and deepening the unresolved mysteries surrounding her lineage, moving us closer to the full requested length. There is something unsettling about families who produce legends. The public sees brilliance, beauty, scandal, death, but rarely do they look at the foundation beneath it all. In Ludovica's case, that foundation was built not on ambition, but on containment. She learned early that her feelings were secondary to strategy. That lesson did not vanish with adulthood. It shaped how she raised her children. At Passenhofen, the atmosphere was freer than most royal households. The children rode horses without excessive supervision. They swam the lake. They hiked through forests. They spoke informally. Nicknames replaced rigid titles. Outsiders sometimes interpreted this as negligence. Others saw it as progressive. In truth, it was likely instinct. Ludovica had grown up under relentless etiquette. She knew what suffocation felt like. She allowed her children air. But freedom without preparation can be dangerous when destiny intervenes. Elisabeth's struggle in Vienna was not only about cruelty from a court. It was about cultural shock. She had been raised in emotional openness. Suddenly, she was thrust into a structure that rewarded calculation. The conflict was internal before it became public. Letters from the early years of her marriage reveal homesickness so intense it bordered on despair. Elisabeth clung to memories of Passenhofen as if they were proof that another life had once existed. For Ludovica, reading those letters must have felt like watching her own youth replayed with higher stakes. But she could not retrieve her daughter. Imperial marriage was irreversible. The tension between Bavaria and Austria also played a subtle role. The Bavarian branch of the Wittelsbach family had long maintained its distinct identity. Austria's Habsburg court operated with deeper layers of conservatism and hierarchy. Elizabeth entered not only a marriage, but a cultural battlefield. Meanwhile, within Bavaria itself, change was brewing. King Ludwig II's increasingly erratic governance created anxiety among political elites. His romantic escapism, while captivating to the public imagination, destabilized administrative confidence. Sophie Charlotte's broken engagement placed Ludovica in an awkward position. Her daughter had been publicly tied to the king. The dissolution was not just personal, it was political theater. Some speculated that Ludwig's hesitation was linked to his private life, to desires incompatible with dynastic expectations. Others argued he feared repeating the emotionally barren marriages common among royalty. What is certain is that Sophie bore the humiliation quietly, and Ludovica stood behind her, absorbing the social fallout. In private moments, one wonders if mother and daughter ever discussed patterns. Did Sophie ask, "Why are our engagements so fragile?" Did Ludovica answer with silence? There's a recurring motif in this family's history: emotional intensity paired with institutional rigidity. Ludovika herself had been paired with a man who valued artistic freedom over domestic harmony. Ludwig II escaped into architectural fantasy. Elizabeth escaped into travel and physical discipline. Rudolf sought intellectual reform within an inflexible empire. When emotional sensitivity collides with immovable systems, fracture is almost inevitable. The tragedy of Mayerling illustrates this collision most starkly. Rudolf, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was intellectually restless. He entertained liberal ideas. He criticized conservative structures. His marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium was strained and reportedly devoid of affection. His relationship with Baroness Mary Vetsera culminated in the fatal event at the hunting lodge in January 1889. The official explanation, a murder-suicide pact, satisfied few. Documents were sealed. Narratives were adjusted. The imperial image required containment. Ludovika, far from the epicenter, received filtered information. But she understood dynastic secrecy. She had lived long enough to recognize when truth was being managed. The psychological impact on Elizabeth was catastrophic. After Rudolf's death, she retreated almost entirely from ceremonial life. Her identity shifted from reluctant empress to wandering widow in black long before Franz Joseph's death. Ludovika watched her daughter unravel in slow motion, and she could do nothing. There is a particular helplessness in aging motherhood. When children are young, danger feels manageable. When they are adults navigating political labyrinths, protection becomes symbolic at best. By the late 1880s, Ludovika had lost not only illusions but physical strength. Yet her mind remained sharp. Visitors to Herzog Max Palace described rooms filled with instruments measuring time and weather. It was almost metaphorical. Outside, storms gathered across Europe. Inside, she tracked atmospheric pressure, as if anticipating turbulence. Her religious devotion deepened with age, though it never became theatrical. She attended Massachusetts. She observed rituals. Faith offered structure where personal life had often lacked fairness. Still, faith did not shield her from doubt. The question of that early love, the Portuguese king who had once asked for her hand, lingers in historical curiosity. What if she had married him? Miguel's own reign in Portugal was marked by authoritarian conflict and eventual exile. His political career ended in defeat. Marriage to him might not have guaranteed happiness, but it would have been chosen. Choice is a powerful psychological difference. Ludovika's life was shaped largely by decisions made around her, not by her. Yet within constraint, she exercised subtle agency. She mediated marriages for her children. She advocated when possible. She maintained correspondence networks. She preserved Bavarian identity within a web of intermarriages that diluted cultural boundaries. Her legacy is less dramatic than assassination or deposition. It is infrastructural. Without her steady presence, it is difficult to imagine how the family would have navigated repeated crises without implosion. The end of the 19th century approached with ominous undertones. Nationalist fervor intensified in the Balkans. Industrialization empowered new social classes. Monarchies appeared grand, but increasingly fragile. Rudolf's death removed a potential reformist heir. Franz Joseph aged into stubborn conservatism. Elizabeth drifted. Within Bavaria, Ludwig II's death had already exposed vulnerability in royal mystique. Ludovika's generation had been raised to believe in divine right and dynastic permanence. Her grandchildren inherited a world questioning both. When she died in 1892, Europe stood on the brink of transformation it could not yet name. Her passing marked not just personal loss, but generational transition. Elizabeth would be assassinated 6 years later in Geneva by Luigi Licini, an Italian anarchist who targeted royalty as a symbol of inequality. The blade that pierced the empress's heart also symbolically pierced the illusion of untouchable monarchy. Ludovika did not witness that final chapter, but the trajectory was already visible in her lifetime. If one traces the emotional arc of her existence, it begins with romantic denial, moves through dutiful endurance, expands into maternal vigilance, and concludes with resigned observation. There is tension not because she rebelled loudly, but because she did not. Silence can carry its own drama. In historical retrospection, it is tempting to center spectacle, yet the quieter figures often shape outcomes more profoundly. Had Ludovika raised her children with stricter discipline, would Elisabeth have adapted better to Vienna? Or would her spirit have broken sooner? Had she discouraged Ludwig Wilhelm's marriage to an actress more forcefully, would later scandals have been mitigated? Had she pushed Sophie Charlotte differently during the engagement crisis, will Bavaria's royal narrative have shifted? These are unanswerable hypotheticals, but they reveal her position at critical junctions. She stood at intersections repeatedly, and at each one, she chose preservation over confrontation, preservation of dignity, preservation of family cohesion, preservation of identity. The image of her walking alone along Lake Starnberg in late afternoon light remains one of the most evocative symbols of her life. A woman born into ceremony, seeking solace in simplicity. A duchess preferring forests to ballrooms. A mother fearing for a daughter who would become a legend. Perhaps that is the final tension. Legends simplify, reality complicates. The cinematic portrayal of her as a gentle, smiling maternal figure cannot capture the layers of disappointment, calculation, strength, and restraint that defined her. She was neither villain nor saint. She was a woman negotiating power structures far larger than herself. And though she never wore a crown, she bore its weight indirectly through those who did. Her story does not end with fireworks. It ends with continuity fading quietly into history. Yet the reverberations of her choices echo in every retelling of Sisi's tragedy, every speculation about Mayerling, every mystery surrounding Ludwig II. To understand the visible catastrophes of the 19th century European courts, one must look at the quiet rooms where mothers read letters in silence, where decisions were absorbed rather than announced, where resilience replaced romance. Ludovika's life invites a different kind of suspense, not the suspense of sudden violence, but of sustained endurance under pressure. And sometimes that is far more haunting. I will continue expanding further, deepening the political atmosphere of late 19th century Europe, exploring additional personal correspondences, and further layering psychological tension as we move toward the full requested length. As the 19th century moved toward its final decade, Europe glittered on the surface and trembled underneath. Railways cut across old borders. Telegraph wires carried messages faster than any rider on horseback ever could. Newspapers amplified rumor into sensation. Monarchies still held power, but the aura of untouchable divinity had begun to erode. Ludovika had been born into a world where kings ruled by inherited certainty. She would die in one where that certainty was questioned in cafes, universities, and factories. She sensed the shift, not as a politician, not as a reformer, but as a woman who observed patterns. Her grandchildren represented a new generation of royalty navigating modern scrutiny. They were photographed, criticized, followed. Elisabeth, especially, became a paradox. Revered for beauty, mythologized for sorrow, she resisted the very public that adored her. She exercised obsessively. She guarded her image. She fled ceremonial obligations whenever possible. There is an argument among historians that Elizabeth's lifelong restlessness was not merely personal temperament, but inherited sensitivity amplified by imperial confinement. If so, Ludovika was the origin point of that sensitivity within this branch of the family. At Possenhofen, emotional expression had been permitted. Imagination had not been punished. Physical freedom had been normal. Vienna punished deviation. The collision left marks that no crown could conceal. Meanwhile, Ludwig Wilhelm's line produced its own ripple effects. His daughter, Marie-Louise, Countess Larisch, became entangled in the Mayerling affair. She acted as intermediary between Crown Prince Rudolf and Mary Vetsera. After the tragedy, she was cast out from court society, blamed for facilitating the relationship. Thus, the scandal circled back to Ludovica's bloodline from two directions, through Elisabeth's son and through Ludwig Wilhelm's daughter. It is a chilling symmetry. Even without direct involvement, Ludovica's descendants stood at the center of catastrophe. And then there is the question of psychological inheritance. Within the Wittelsbach family, a pattern of emotional extremity is frequently noted. Artistic genius intertwined with instability. Romantic idealism bordering on impracticality. Withdrawal from duty when internal conflict became unbearable. King Ludwig II exemplified this duality. His architectural masterpieces, like Neuschwanstein, were born of imagination so vivid it reshaped landscapes. Yet his governance suffered from detachment. Was this temperament purely individual? Or was it cultivated in an environment that encouraged feeling but offered limited outlets for authentic fulfillment? Ludovica's parenting style, often described as affectionate and informal, may have fostered deep emotional bonds among siblings, but it also may have left them less armored for the brutality of political reality. That tension is not a condemnation. It is a complexity. A mother must choose what kind of strength to instill. Ludovica chose humanity over hardness. When Sophie Charlotte's engagement dissolved, Ludovica's response was protective rather than punitive. She did not publicly shame her daughter. She absorbed gossip with composure. When rumors surrounded Mathilde's conduct in Italy, she refused to abandon her. When Karl Theodor chose medicine over pure aristocratic expectation, she supported him. Her instinct was not to enforce rigid dynastic conformity, but to adapt within limits. That adaptability may have prevented greater fractures. Yet even adaptability has limits against structural power. Elisabeth's alienation in Vienna grew sharper after Mayerling. She avoided court functions. She insisted on extensive travel. She became almost spectral in her own empire. Observers described her as distant, elusive, perpetually in motion. Franz Joseph remained devoted in his own restrained manner, but he embodied the state. Stability was his creed. Change threatened order. Rudolf's death had not only broken a family, it had destabilized succession. In the background, political alliances shifted uneasily. Germany unified under Prussian dominance. Italy consolidated. France oscillated between republic and empire. The Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867 had created a dual monarchy, but tensions between ethnic groups simmered. All of this unfolded during Ludovica's lifetime. She had witnessed the Congress of Vienna's aftermath in her childhood. She had seen the revolutions of 1848 shake thrones. She had observed wars redraw borders. Yet through it all, her own daily concerns often centered on letters from children, on illnesses, on engagements, on mourning clothes. History moves at two speeds: the grand sweep of nations and the intimate pulse of families. Ludovica inhabited both, though she influenced only one directly. Her correspondence reveals a mind attentive to nuance. She was not oblivious to politics. She understood that Elisabeth's marriage had geopolitical implications. She recognized that Ludwig II's instability endangered Bavaria's reputation, but she rarely inserted herself into public debate. Her power was relational, not legislative. Toward the end of her life, physical frailty contrasted with mental clarity. She continued to track time obsessively. Clocks ticked in her rooms, as if marking not just hours but eras. One can imagine her sitting near a window in winter, barometer on the table, snow falling over Munich. Did she ever calculate how many losses she had endured? 2 infants buried in early motherhood, a marriage devoid of passion, a daughter trapped in imperial sorrow, a grandson dead under scandalous circumstances, a son publicly criticized for marrying beneath rank, a daughter's broken royal engagement. The mental tally must have been heavy, yet accounts rarely describe her as bitter. There's restraint in that. Perhaps she understood something fundamental about her position in history. She was not meant to dominate headlines. She was meant to endure them. Her death in 1892 came quietly. No violent interruption, no political spectacle. She passed at 83, an advanced age for her time. In death, as in life, she did not create drama. But drama followed her lineage relentlessly after. In 1898, when Elisabeth was assassinated in Geneva, Europe gasped. An empress struck down by an anarchist file sharpened into a blade. The vulnerability of monarchy exposed brutally. Franz Joseph reportedly whispered that nothing had been spared him in this world. Had Ludovika lived to see that moment, what would she have thought? Would she have interpreted it as final confirmation that crowns carry curses? Or would she have framed it as political inevitability in an age of rising dissent? We cannot know. What we can examine is the pattern of emotional cost attached to public power within her family. The deeper one studies Ludovika, the clearer it becomes that her life was not an isolated narrative, but the emotional prelude to a dynasty's unraveling. She stands at the midpoint between Napoleonic Europe and pre-World War Europe. Born into restoration, mother to crisis, grandmother to collapse. There is quiet tragedy in being the hinge between eras. She did not initiate catastrophe, but she absorbed its tremors. Even the seemingly small detail of her fascination with measurement instruments carries metaphorical weight. Clocks measure time, but cannot slow it. Barometers predict storms, but cannot prevent them. Thermometers record temperature, but cannot alter climate. Perhaps she surrounded herself with these devices not out of obsession, but out of realism. If she could not control destiny, she could at least observe it accurately. Observation is a form of dignity, and dignity was her chosen armor. In the mythology surrounding Sisi, Ludovika often fades into background softness. Yet without understanding her, Sisi's fragility appears abrupt. Without understanding her, Sophie Charlotte's heartbreak seems isolated. Without understanding her, the emotional tone of this branch of the Wittelsbach family lacks context. She transmitted sensitivity along with resilience. She modeled survival without spectacle, and perhaps that is the most unsettling aspect of her story. She did everything correctly within the expectations placed upon her. And still, tragedy found her family repeatedly. It challenges the comforting belief that duty guarantees safety. In royal courts, as in ordinary life, obedience does not shield against loss. As the century closed, the illusion of stable monarchies shimmered but cracked. Within 26 years of Ludovika's death, Europe would descend into world war. Empires would fall, thrones would vanish. The Austro-Hungarian Empire would dissolve entirely. The Bavarian monarchy would collapse. The world her father had ruled would become memory, and yet her descendants, scattered across Europe, carried fragments of her character into the 20th century. Measure composure, emotional intensity, attachment to nature, a tension between freedom and responsibility. In examining her life, one senses that the true suspense is not about singular mysteries like Mayerling or Ludwig's drowning. It is about endurance within inevitability. How does a woman maintain coherence when every generation she nurtures faces disproportionate sorrow? How does she reconcile faith with repeated loss? How does she accept that the love she was denied might have altered everything, yet still fulfill her role without rebellion? These questions linger longer than any official document. They make her story human rather than ornamental. She was not merely the mother of an empress. She was the emotional architecture beneath a dynasty whose public tragedies still fascinate historians and filmmakers alike. And as we move deeper into the final years of her life and the aftershocks that followed, the tension does not fade. It deepens, because the closer we examine the past, the more we recognize how fragile even the grandest structures truly were. And at the center of one of those structures stood Ludovika. Quiet, watchful, enduring. There's an image that returns again and again when studying Ludovika's final decade. Not the grand halls of Munich, not the glittering ceremonies of Vienna, but a corridor in Herzog Max Palace, dim in winter light, where footsteps echoed softly against polished floors. Age narrows the world. Rooms once filled with children grow quieter. Letters replace voices. Portraits replace presence. By the late 1880s, Ludovika had become something almost symbolic within her family. Younger generations approached her with a mixture of affection and reverence. She represented stability in a lineage increasingly associated with volatility. Yet stability can feel lonely. Many of her siblings had already died. Friends from youth were gone. The world of her childhood, with its post-Napoleonic Restoration confidence, had dissolved into something sharper and more uncertain. In those quiet years, memory must have grown louder. Memory of Vienna in 1824, of a Portuguese prince with restless eyes, of a proposal denied, of a letter arriving too late. The human mind revisits crossroads, especially when time shortens. Historians often debate whether Ludovika truly never knew that Miguel returned for her. Some argue the family may have delayed or concealed communication to ensure the politically safer marriage proceeded uninterrupted. Others believe the timing was purely unfortunate. The truth cannot be proven conclusively, but the ambiguity itself adds tension. Because if she never knew, then her life was redirected without her awareness. And if she did know, then she accepted sacrifice consciously. Both possibilities carry weight. In either case, she entered marriage without romantic conviction. And from that marriage came 10 pregnancies. 10 times she faced the uncertainty of childbirth in an era when mortality rates were high. 2 infants did not survive. Each loss carved something invisible yet permanent. Grief in the 19th century followed formal rituals. Mourning attire, condolence visits, religious services. But ritual does not eliminate pain. It structures it. Perhaps structure was what allowed Ludovika to continue functioning after loss. Structure had shaped her entire existence. It is tempting to imagine that the birth of Elisabeth in 1837 brought uncomplicated joy, and in many ways it did. Sisi was lively, imaginative, unusually sensitive to atmosphere. But sensitivity is double-edged. The same qualities that made Elisabeth captivating also made her vulnerable to suffocation. Ludovika recognized that. When Franz Joseph chose Elisabeth instead of Helene, the event was framed publicly as romantic destiny. Privately, it was destabilizing. Helene bore rejection quietly. Elisabeth bore expectation abruptly. Ludovika bore anxiety alone. Her letters from that period reveal no triumphal arrogance. Instead, they carry caution. She urged gentleness toward her daughter. She worried about youth confronting empire. It was a mother's foresight, and foresight can be a burden when it proves accurate. In Vienna, Elisabeth's first years were marked by conflict with Archduchess Sophie. The imperial mother-in-law believed in strict oversight. She took control of the children born to Franz Joseph and Elisabeth, citing the empress's youth and inexperience. For Elisabeth, this felt like theft. For Ludovika, reading about it from afar, it must have felt like déjà vu. Authority overriding maternal instinct. Choice overridden by hierarchy. The pattern extended into the next generation. Crown Prince Rudolph's intellectual dissatisfaction mirrored a broader generational shift. Educated, curious, politically aware, he found the rigid conservatism of his father constricting. His marriage to Stephanie of Belgium was reportedly cold. Emotional isolation deepened. When he turned toward Mary Vetsera, he did so not only as a lover, but perhaps as a man seeking escape from expectation. The tragedy at Mayerling was both intimate and political, and Ludovika's bloodline ran through it twice. One branch through Elisabeth, the other through Ludwig Wilhelm's daughter, Countess Larisch, whose involvement complicated family relationships irreparably. After Mayerling, Larisch was ostracized. Blame required a target. She became convenient. Family gatherings grew more cautious. Trust thinned. Scandal reshapes internal dynamics long after headlines fade. By this point, Ludovika was in her 80s. 80 years of observation had taught her that public narrative and private truth rarely align. She had seen too many simplified explanations. Her own marriage reduced to propriety. Her own love story reduced to rumor. Her daughter's misery reduced to romantic legend. Her grandson's death reduced to official communique. Reality is messier, and she knew it. Visitors during her final winters described her as smaller physically but undiminished mentally. She followed developments across Europe. She asked questions. She listened carefully. There is no evidence she indulged in dramatic conspiracy theories regarding Mayerling or Ludwig II's drowning. But neither did she display naive acceptance of official stories. She lived long enough to recognize the utility of silence. Monarchies survive on controlled information. Ludovika had spent a lifetime navigating between what could be spoken and what must remain implied. In the late 19th century, anarchist movements gained visibility. Assassinations became political statements. Royalty increasingly symbolized inequality to radical thinkers. The idea that crowns were divinely protected no longer convinced everyone. Though Ludovika would die before Elisabeth's assassination, the undercurrent of hostility toward aristocracy was already present. She must have sensed it. The barometer in her room might have registered atmospheric pressure, but social pressure was harder to quantify. And yet, in some ways, she had always lived under pressure. From childhood performance at court, to arranged marriage, to managing a household shaped by a husband's unpredictability, to raising children destined for scrutiny. Pressure had been constant. Perhaps that is why she did not fracture publicly. She had adapted incrementally for decades. It is striking that despite personal dissatisfaction, Ludovika did not encourage rebellion in her children against monarchy itself. She encouraged personal authenticity within structure. Karl Theodor's medical career is a telling example. In another household, such deviation might have been discouraged as diminishing aristocratic dignity. In hers, it was supported. He founded a respected eye clinic. He performed thousands of surgeries. He restored sight to common citizens. That act alone subtly redefined what noble purpose could mean. Not just governance, service. Ludovika's influence may have contributed to that broader understanding of duty. Her legacy, then, is not only emotional, it is ethical. She modeled responsibility without cruelty, endurance without theatrical martyrdom. As her health declined in early 1892, there were no dramatic final speeches recorded, no public declarations. Death came as culmination rather than interruption. When she passed on January 26th, she left behind a family network woven tightly but strained by history. Elisabeth would continue her restless travels. Franz Joseph would reign until 1916, witnessing World War's devastation. The Austro-Hungarian Empire would crumble. Bavaria's monarchy would end in 1918. The world of dynastic certainty would collapse within a generation of her death. In retrospect, Ludovika appears almost like the last guardian of a transitional age, born when monarchies reasserted themselves after revolution, dead before revolution permanently dismantled them. Her life spans restoration to prelude of collapse, and through that span runs a consistent thread: personal sacrifice subordinated to collective expectation. When modern audiences view dramatizations of Sisi's life, they often focus on glittering gowns and tragic romance. But behind the cinematic softness stands a harder truth. The mother who understood too well what awaited her daughter. The woman who had once faced a crossroads and watched choice slip away. The duchess who opened windows wide because air was the one freedom she could guarantee herself. If suspense is the tension between what is known and what remains uncertain, Ludovika's story contains both. We know dates, births, marriages, deaths. We do not know the full texture of her regrets. We do not know whether she forgave those who arranged her fate. We do not know whether she believed her sacrifices meaningful in the end. But we do know this: she did not collapse. She did not abandon her children. She did not surrender to bitterness. And in a dynasty marked by dramatic implosions, that restraint is extraordinary. Her life was not a spectacle. It was a steady flame, and sometimes in the long corridor of history, It is the steady flames that keep entire structures from going dark too soon. We continue forward, because the true weight of her legacy becomes even clearer when examining what happened after she was gone. After Ludovica's death, the rooms she once occupied did not immediately feel empty. Her presence lingered in habits, in the way windows were opened each morning for fresh air, in the measured ticking of clocks she had insisted on maintaining, in the long walks her children and grandchildren continued out of instinct rather than obligation. But absence has a delayed echo. At first, life continued along familiar tracks. Letters were still written, visits still arranged, ceremonies still observed. Yet something intangible had shifted. The center had disappeared. Elisabeth, already emotionally distant from Vienna, seemed to drift even further after losing her mother. Though their relationship had never been demonstrative in the theatrical sense, Ludovica had been the last living witness to her daughter's unguarded childhood. With her gone, there was no one left who remembered Sisi before the crown. No one left who could say, "I knew you when you ran barefoot by the lake." Memory itself had lost its anchor. In the years that followed, Europe accelerated toward instability. Political tensions sharpened. National identities hardened. Industrial power amplified dissent. Royalty continued to appear in parades and portraits, but the aura of permanence was cracking. In 1898, when Elisabeth was assassinated in Geneva by an anarchist who had not even originally intended to target her specifically, the news traveled across continents within hours. A sharpened file, a single thrust to the chest, a delayed collapse. At first, she believed she had only been struck. She boarded the boat. She walked. Then she fainted. The wound, small and precise, had pierced her heart. The empress who had once been a restless girl at Possenhofen died, not in a palace, but anonymously, in transit. The symbolism was brutal. A life spent fleeing confinement ended in public violence. Ludovica did not live to see that day. But if history has a cruel symmetry, then perhaps it is this. The mother who feared the weight of empire was spared witnessing its final blow against her child. And still, the unraveling continued. In 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand ignited World War. Within 4 years, empires collapsed like dominoes. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved. The German Empire fell. The Bavarian monarchy ended. Crowns that had once dictated destinies were swept aside by revolution and exhaustion. The world Ludovica had been born and ceased to exist. Looking back across that arc, her life appears almost like a bridge suspended between two incompatible eras. She was born into Restoration optimism after the chaos of Napoleon's campaigns. She died just before modern political violence became systemic. She raised children taught to believe in dynastic continuity. She became grandmother to a generation that would witness dynastic extinction. That tension gives her story its quiet gravity. Because she did everything she was taught to do, she honored her father's decision. She fulfilled her marital duty. She bore children. She upheld decorum. She preserved family cohesion. And still, destiny did not reward obedience with stability. This is not a fairy tale. It is something far more unsettling. It is the story of a woman who understood the system from within and yet could not shield those she loved from its consequences. There is one final image that feels fitting. An elderly duchess standing by a window in Munich during winter. Snow softens the sharp edges of rooftops. The sky hangs low and colorless. Inside, the air smells faintly of paper, wax, and polished wood. On a nearby table, a clock ticks steadily. A barometer rests beside it. Time measured, pressure measured, storms anticipated. Outside, the world prepares to transform in ways she will not live to see. Inside, she stands composed, not triumphant, not defeated, simply enduring. History often magnifies the spectacular deaths. The drowning king, the assassinated empress, the crown prince in a hunting lodge surrounded by unanswered questions. But before them, there was Ludovica, the woman who lost her first great love to politics, the wife who spent her first anniversary in tears, the mother who sensed danger before others saw it. The grandmother who buried more than one generation. She did not build fairy tale castles. She did not wear an imperial crown. She did not die dramatically. Yet she was the emotional spine of a dynasty that continues to fascinate the world. Without her, there is no Sisi as we know her. No fragile empress yearning for freedom. No Sophie Charlotte at the edge of a broken royal engagement. No Karl Theodore choosing healing over hierarchy. No tangled bloodline intersecting at Mayerling. She is the quiet origin point. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of her life is not that she suffered, is that she understood suffering in advance. She recognized the cost of power. She recognized the fragility of romantic dreams inside political machinery. She recognized that crowns glitter brightest before they crack. In the end, what remains of Ludovika is not spectacle. It is resilience. A woman born into constraint who carved dignity out of limitation. A mother who opened windows wide so her children could breathe, even if the world outside was unforgiving. A duchess who measured time not to control it, but to bear witness as it moved relentlessly forward. Her story closes not with a scream, but with a steady heartbeat fading into silence. And sometimes that is the most haunting ending of all.